A very good evening to our esteemed panelists and participants. Thank you for joining us today. I am Shruti, joined by my colleague Priti from the Foundation for Democratic Reforms. Welcome to the concluding session of this edition of the Indian Democracy at Work conference on the theme Rule of Law. Over the past 9 days, we have deeply explored the state of rule of law in our country and the various challenges plaguing our institutions, the police, the prosecution, the judiciary, as well as the cumbersome procedural framework that guides them. Through our 8 thematic sessions, we identified some of the key factors that contribute to the fear and mistrust of police, shoddy crime investigation, low conviction rates, and inordinate delays in adjudication, all of which contribute to the public's lack of confidence in the formal justice system. Through our conversations on women's safety, cybercrime, extraordinary laws, fake news, and economic growth, we explored the significance of rule of law to our evolving society through various perspectives. Our esteemed panelists, drawing from their diverse experiences, pointed us towards some important, forward-thinking, and imperative reforms to make our justice system deliver better results. This session marks the culmination of a week-long intensive discourse into a small set of pragmatic and actionable recommendations to be pursued in due course. I would like to introduce our distinguished guests here today. Our chair for the session is Shri Justice Kurian Joseph, a former judge of the Supreme Court of India. Our keynote speaker is Shri Prithviraj Chavan, the former Chief Minister of Maharashtra. From our partner organizations, we have Professor K.C. Suri, Political Science Professor at the University of Hyderabad. We also have Shri D.N.V. Kumaraguru, Director, External Relations at the Indian School of Business. A warm welcome to all of you. Finally, we have with us Dr. Jaiprakash Narayan, General Secretary, Foundation for Democratic Reforms. Thank you for leading this initiative, sir. I would now like to request our chair, Justice Kurian Joseph, to present his opening remarks and facilitate the discussion.
Thank you, Sudhin. First of all, let me congratulate the organizers for thinking about Indian democracy and what we can do. So unless we think about it, we may not be in a position to know what to do. We do many things without actually knowing what to do. So this exercise which you are being undertaking the last 9 days is actually an exercise for making a roadmap. First of all, aligning the road, and thereafter actually properly laying the road, and then rather designing, laying, and properly aligning. Yeah, that must be the proper order. Congratulations, Dr. Jaiprakash and all the organizers. Let me salute the professors first, the gurus. Professor K.C. Suri, Sri Kumaraguru, and Honorable Sri Prithviraj Chavan, the former Chief Minister of one of the most prominent states in the country, Maharashtra. Sweta, Suri, and dear sisters and brothers. Yes, we are on rule of law. Rule of law is actually a basic structure as far as the constitution of the concerned. For the very existence of the country, there must be rule of law. And independence of judiciary is actually a basic structure to the rule of law. This is where I would be slightly concentrated because I come from that stream. Of late, the credibility of that institution has been shaken. Unless its independence, its purity is actually, which is the basis of the trust of the public, where their last word or last ray of hope, that they will get a correct ruling on law. A correct ruling on law is very important for rule of law, for maintaining rule of law. If it is show me the man, I'll show you the law, the credibility is shaken. If it is applied differently to different people, it is shaken. If it is delayed, it is shaken. If it is access becomes difficult, it is taken. All these are some of the aspects which we need to worry about rather than be concerned about. These are times we ought to be worrying on some of these aspects. To me, I feel judiciary needs to be appropriately insulated to restore its credibility. The tectonic plates of our judiciary is disaligned, so disaligned that the aftershocks continue to perceptibly record in the seismograph of Indian democracy. That seismograph of Indian democracy is now actually being taken note of by the world around also, as to why this institution, where the people had high aspirations that even if the heavens fall, this institution will not fall. That was the hope. Where we have been able to live up to that aspirations of the founding fathers of our constitution, and whether we are able to live up to the expectations of the nation on this institution is one of the crucial questions we need to think about. I've just taken my assistance from a British judge, Lord Bingham, who had in fact taught about 8 points on the rule of law aspects. If there is to be a proper rule of law, we need all these 8 elements. The first is legal certainty. The law must be accessible and, so far as possible, intelligible, clear, and predictable. I wonder, going by the trends that we have been watching or seeing or experiencing, whether it has been predictable, whether it has been clear, and whether it has been intelligible. Inaccessibility is, of course, a grave concern which you are addressing otherwise. The second, law and not discretion. In a proper rule of law concept, there is hardly any scope for discretion. If discretion prevails, if discretion overshadows rule of law, then it's not a country governed by rule of law. It's not a democratic country. Questions of legal right and liability should ordinarily be resolved by application of the law, or not by the exercise of discretion. The moment discretion substitutes legal procedure or due process of law, then it's a big threat to maintenance of rule of law. Third, equality before law. The laws of the land should apply equally to all, save to the extent that objective differences justify differentiation. How will we be able to justify objectively this differentiation in applying law? We have seen in pandemic times how our courts have been functioning, in the sense have been applying law, starting from the apex court to the various high courts. These are the 2 constitutional courts, so I don't go to the other courts. But because these courts have a great role to maintain rule of law, because they have been bestowed with the constitutional authority to say what the constitution is and what the law is and how the law should be ruled. And third, fourth, yes, rights guarantees. The law must afford adequate protection of fundamental human rights. That's a special phraseology used by Lord Bingham. Lord Bingham says, is fundamental human rights, which are indivisible, inalienable, inherent, and universal. fundamental human rights. The judiciary must protect those fundamental human rights, irrespective of your caste, your color, your creed, your position, your philosophy, your political affiliation, your position, your power. Yes. And fifth, access to justice and to the courts. It means means must be provided for resolving without prohibitive cost or inordinate delay bona fide civil disputes which the parties themselves are unable to resolve. After all, why do people come to court? To me, I feel they come to court to settle their disputes which they were not able to settle, number one, to establish their rights, to resolve their disputes, which is actually the part of the first aspect, and for redressal of grievances. On which aspect are we able to give a proper, effective, and expeditious solution? Despite all the amendments we have been introducing, we have been bringing out tribunals, we have been amending laws, we have been introducing alternate dispute resolution mechanisms also. Yes, with all that, if all these are to be effective, your concept on the independence, purity of rule of law should be clear, intelligible, and you should be clear about the role of rule of law. And sixth, government servants exercise limited powers in good faith. Ministers and public officers at all levels must exercise the powers conferred on them reasonably, in good faith, for the purpose for which powers were conferred and without exceeding the limits of such powers. Executive powers is a very vast topic. I can see on my left and right two top executives, one the Honorable Chief Minister, former Chief Minister of State of Maharashtra, and one in the Administrative Service, Dr. Jayaprakash. They have vast experience of the exercise of executive powers. To what extent these executive powers have been excessive, actually challenging the rule of law, is something to be examined. Seventh, because their oath, because I wanted to remind this at this time, the third schedule, they have taken an oath to defend the Constitution. That's very important. The judges take an oath to uphold the Constitution. The ministers take an oath, the President of India and the ministers take an oath to defend the Constitution. 7, adjudicative procedures provided by the state should be fair. There is fairness in adjudication. 7th is fairness in adjudication. Adjudicative procedures provided by the state should be fair. Is that the procedure provided by the state now fair? I don't say they are unfair, but are they fair? It's a question that we need to address. And the last, the 8th one, observance of international law. Because it is, we are positioned as a country in the world democracy, world's largest and most effective democracy we claim to be. So we need to show, not only profess so, but we need to practice so. And we need to show so that we are an effective democracy by observing also the international principles. The rule of law requires compliance by the state with its obligations in international law, the law which whether deriving from the treaty or international custom and practice governs the conduct of the nations. Therefore, my dear friends, I just referred to all these 8 aspects. I thought there's no better way of putting it on the rule of law as a culminating point of our 9-day discussions. With this, I leave the floor to the next speaker, and let's see how the interactions would go. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Shruti, will you invite Sri Prithviraj Chavan?
Oh, no? Yes, Dr. Prithviraj Chavan.
Thank you. That is a very vast sweep of things from you, Justice Joseph. Thank you, Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan, for inviting me for this interesting seminar. You had been at work for almost a week now, and excellent document that you sent us encourages me to take part in it. I come from a perspective of a practicing politician, particularly not a legal practitioner. So I have seen both in the central government when I was a minister in the Prime Minister's office, and particularly for some time I handled the Department of Personnel, which also supervises CBI. So I am quite familiar with the working of the CBI. And of course, as Chief Minister here in Maharashtra, I had the law and judiciary portfolio. Although I am not, as I said in the beginning, not a legally trained person. So I bring a perspective, this whole debate, from a point of a practicing politician. Excellent document that has been brought out and shows that we have dealt with it various times in our political careers. Bring out a few things about lacuna in our policing system, lacuna in our prosecution system, problems of judiciary, dependencies, the shortage of staff, and ultimately how much money we are able to spend on these services as a part of our GDP. And when you compare to the other big democracies, how woefully short we fall. Few things at the outset, I would like to say that the concept of rule of law is not really ingrained in our society. It's a concept which was brought in after the British rule, founding fathers who mostly studied in Britain and saw the British system work very closely. At times, I wonder if I had worked in Germany or in the United States, probably we would have a different kind of a constitution. But yes, it is a great tribute to the founding fathers that they could agree to frame a constitution like the one we have today. Constitution has been amended many times to suit the needs of the day. One thing which is rankled, which I also tried to mention it in the last seminar also, is that the principle of separation of powers, which is the bedrock of the American system and which we also claim to have in our system here, is not working very effectively. Particularly the point that I like to make is the day the legislature elects the head of the political party at the state level or the national level, the person then is sworn in as a prime minister or a chief minister of the state. The legislature virtually commits a harakiri, particularly because we have, as we mentioned last time, I agree with him, particularly because the anti-defection law that we had enacted some time back for good reasons, because of the political culture prevailing at that time. As a result, what happens, neither can a legislation be sponsored from the floor, nor can the legislation which is proposed by the government, Prime Minister particularly, or his executive, can be drastically amended without the consent of the leaders. And virtually, there is hardly any say. The committee system doesn't work as effectively as it works in the Western countries. And I think we need to look at some political reforms, particularly how we can strengthen the concept of separation of powers between the three wings. Of late, Professor Justice Kurian mentioned about the state of judiciary, and I think we're all concerned about what is happening. Why is it happening? And why is the government of the day getting away with so many things which are definitely do not conform to strict democratic norms for the rule of law? That's my first point, that we need to look at basically political reforms. Another parameter of political reforms, I would really say, are system of elections, particularly system of electoral funding, really have a lot to be desired. And a lot of ills come out of that. And I refer to particularly the political control of police forces. Once a political party gets elected, or a person becomes executive authority, the minister, and all that, and he tends to concentrate all the powers with him or her. The chief minister would try to control the police forces completely, and many times to suit the political purpose. And therefore, police forces and the entire policing machinery gets compromised completely. We have problems with our prosecution system. Prosecutor does not bring forward the evidence with little that a judge can do, and justice is not delivered because the prosecutors have failed in it. System of this political reform, of course, there could go on into many aspects of all that, but I just stop there. Second theme I'd like to pursue is that we're all clear that there is a shortage of staff at every level. The prosecutors, the judges, and everywhere, the forensic labs, and whatever element of judicial system or policing system, all that, I think we are hugely short of staff because we are not spending enough, not allocating enough resources in our budgets, because there are other priorities, and the priorities for building more courtrooms or having more judges or building good housing colonies for police personnel to make their life better training facilities. Why are you not able to create them? Because you don't spend enough money. And that is the last of priorities. When you look at the GDP spent on policing or on judiciary and all that, and the number of judges, all those excellent statistics that have been produced by various committees that have gone on so far. And in your report here, it becomes adequately clear that we need to increase our strength of police forces per million people or unit population, or prosecutors or judges, and everything has to be increased many folds, 10 times, 20 times, 5 times. That requires money. How can civil society, how can public at large bring pressure on the political system? That yes, I need a bridge, I need a road, I need a new school and hospital, yes. But I also need good policing service, I need a good judicial service where I get access to justice at a low cost and speedy justice, dependency courts reduced and all that. But why are you not able to bring that pressure on the political system when making budgets to make sure that we make adequate provisions to make the gap, which has been adequately brought out by every single report that summarized beautifully. So I think we need to work out a mechanism how to bring political pressure on the lawmakers, on the people who frame budgets, so allocate the resources that we collect as taxes into various aspects of the development. Well, one thing is very clear: law and order, predictable justice system, contracts resolution. All these things are a very critical and important component of economic reforms. We all want large investments to flow in our country so that we can create employment, we can collect more taxes and develop our society. But we're not getting adequate investment. Our limits on our own investments are there. We can only produce so much from our economy. If the economic growth rate stagnates as it is now, then that ability to spend on development becomes further eroded. We need foreign investment, but foreign investment won't come unless there is a much better legal system or a judicial system than we have today. So how do you bring pressure and how do you connect that this is an important component of economic reforms, it's an important concept of economic development. Without that, there'll be limits to growth. That's second point. Quality of justice that we seem to be delivering is falling by the day. I think there needs to be drastic reforms in a legal education. I would very strongly advocate that we should have a uniform legal system, maybe something which is practiced in national law schools across the country, all the state government colleges and the private colleges, and make it compulsory for a person who graduates after a full 5-year degree law course. Either he goes for a higher degree, LLM or something, but all is compulsorily undergoes at least 1 year internship. Many people do that. I think high courts recruit some people as interns. Compulsory internship as law clerks or whatever capacity in sessions courts, high courts, and other courts. So that many people who go to national law schools, and they're of course very bright young children, none of them want to practice law. They mostly join corporate sector. That is my experience, and maybe the actual statistics may be different. But how do you encourage them to work in the delivering of a court system? There are a few other random points which I'd like to, particularly CBI. I have been in charge of CBI for some time in the Ministry of Department of Personnel. CBI works under the Delhi Special Police Establishment Act. I think there is a strong debate going on whether CBI needs a separate enactment, whether CBI should be patterned a little more on the pattern of FBI, where they get jurisdiction throughout the country for certain crimes. But that's not easy to implement because states have their own strong views on that. But I think a separate special legislation for CBI, just like we have special legislation from NIA, would not be a bad idea. It should be considered. It was debated many times, but we're not gone further. The massive expansion in needed in our training system. We need to have more forensic universities, of course, forensic labs, and separation of prosecution and investigation was also debated very strongly in CBI and also debated very strongly in the state government. But I think we need to bring in some finality to how the prosecution works in India. There are huge problems. Should we adopt the American pattern? Should we have a hybrid system? Should the office of the prosecutor, the state office of the prosecutor, be strengthened, and prosecutors should direct investigation? Those issues which are for the legal luminaries to wonder and come to a conclusion. How do you put pressure that we need reforms? Because business as usual won't do. Things are breaking down. You've seen mob law at work, lynch mobs taking law in their own hands, particularly the Hyderabad case, the great case in Hyderabad. Police lynched the accused, and people celebrated. And they were felicitated because that reflects on the judicial system. That nobody's sure that any case would reach any finality. Kerala case or the Bharat case and other cases for us. Is it because of the fact that we have disconnect between prosecution and investigation? Seriously consider that. Some models which are best suited to our conditions could be adopted. Things at present are not working clearly. I think basically better training, getting more bright people to join the system, more uniformity, looking at the laws which need to be enacted, and there are discussions will come to further control. Big worry that a lot of democracies, so-called democracies, are moving, veering towards dictatorship. If you take what happened in America in the previous regime, if you look at the Brexit campaign, look at what is happening in Turkey or Russia, even further from China, they don't have democracy, whatever system of government they have concentrated power. Brazil and so many European countries. There is a tendency that democracies at work are slowly veering towards more authoritarian rules. And we in India are also extremely worried that something like that is happening here also. And how we can strengthen the concept of rule of law so that that doesn't really happen in India. One other thing I began by saying that the concept of democracy is not really, we had a different system all over 3 centuries. How do you make sure that the citizenship studies, study of constitution, study of some legal literacy, how is it brought in, mainstreamed into our, say, professional education? It's not mandatory except few legal people that study constitution and system. They have to live in. But other professions, other higher education systems do not have to. Unless you strengthen the citizenship education, the concept of our constitution, concept of rule of law, in our everyday education, in a right earnest, very serious way, given the state of literacy in the country, it will take a long time for people naturally to become aware of their rights under constitution, of their legal rights and all that. It will take a very long time. So how can we speed up that process by making sure that these kind of system, training is built into our professional education? These are the initial remarks that I'd like to discuss in the discussions. Thank you so much.
I think now we thank you, Dr. Prithviraj Chavan, from your experience and from your exposure. Both you have been able to address some of the major concerns, and we really appreciate that you have been so blunt in airing your views. I think the next in the turn we have this Hyderabad declaration by Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My colleagues will take up the declaration. Before that, a few introductory remarks from me, with your permission. We all know that democracy is fragile. It's like a tender plant that requires constant nourishment and rejuvenation. Our founding fathers reposed astounding faith in our people in making democracy work. The fact that we are the only country, at least until that time, to start off with universal franchise on day one, not gradualism. Women, all castes across, rich, poor, literate, illiterate, urban, rural. It's a remarkable and astounding experiment. Today it appears normal, but on that day it was simply breathtaking. And it worked. While we have our problems, and we all recognize that that's the reason why we are sitting here on a Sunday afternoon. But I think in a broader sense, if you take the broad sweep of history, our democracy has worked reasonably well. We have had regular elections, peaceful transfer of power. Our liberty by and large prevailed. Our unity is preserved. Our institutions on the whole served us reasonably well. Our two guests here, both of you, the chair, a very distinguished jurist of great integrity and judicial temperament, and our guest of honor today, Sri Prithviraj Chavan, an outstanding representative of both the legislative and executive branches of our governments at the state and national in the country. You two are great examples of what can happen in a good democracy. That not everybody measures up to your standard is really a problem. It's not that we don't have the promise or with potential. Our concern is about realization in full measure. The recent travels in the US, Sri Prithviraj Chavan mentioned about the obviously semi-authoritarian and authoritarian countries, but even a beacon of hope for democracies across the world for more than 2 centuries. The travels over the past few weeks in the US have been quite spectacular. And that even transfer of power, peaceful transfer of power, was very much in question for quite some time. It shows how incredibly successful we have been, our institutions have been, in ensuring transfer of power with all our imperfections in elections, with all the perversities of a democracy in our conditions. So I am a glass half full kind of a guy. I genuinely see the immense possibilities in the world, even as I recognize the problems. And that is the reason why all three of us came together, these three institutions and organizations, to hold a series of conferences on Indian democracy at work. We must recognize that the initial conditions of our democracy have not been very favorable for democratic growth. There is tremendous asymmetry of power in our country, much more than any other democracy anywhere in the world except in South Asia. The abject poverty of most of the citizens, even today, an average employee in government is more powerful, more secure, and more economically with means than 90% of the people of the country. And illiteracy and ignorance. And that created a tremendous asymmetry of power in the country. And democracies don't work very well when there is so much of asymmetry of power. The ordinary citizens, the bulk of them are so far removed from even the basic living conditions and dignity and confidence and security. Democracy is always very fragile. On top of it, thanks to colonial tradition, not really altered dramatically post-independence, of the service delivery, very poor service delivery by government bureaucracy at the grassroots level, making most of the people dependent on somebody's patronage. That again is not conducive to a good democracy. Then, and perhaps in a large measure even now, we still don't have a notion of citizenship yet. Somehow elections came and therefore the new monarch is chosen by an electoral process. But otherwise, he's still the new monarch. If Sri Prithviraj Chauhan is my representative, I don't care about all the separation of powers. I want him to control the police station. I want him to get justice. I want him to give me water supply and the ration card. I want him to give a job to my son. And I want him to give money when my daughter is getting married. I don't care why or how. So there's no notion of citizenship that we understand from the constitutional point of view, that we create the government for our collective needs, that we fund the government through our taxes to be able to fulfill our needs, and the government is accountable to us and we created it. We are the ultimate power. That is our notion of constitutionality. But that is not the ordinary notion of a voter. Ask Sri Chauhan Sahab. If you go and give constitutional theory to our voters, they probably will reject us instantly, overnight. So these are not conditions that are very conducive to healthy democracy. But there are two guardrails, potentially. A democracy matures, it's never static. In order to mature, there are two institutional underpinnings which are critical. That is where India has been half-hearted. And that's the reason why this series of conferences. If we had really localized power, decentralized power with accountability so that people knew both the possibilities and limitations of power, the availability and the optimal utilization of resources, and the decisions made by citizens in the form of voting and paying taxes and the consequences that visit on their families and lives. If we understood it, not from theory and textbooks, but from life as a living reality, then we would have matured. That's why great scholars said local governments are schools for democracy. To our great sadness as a country, we have never bothered to institutionalize local governments except a few bits and pieces here and there. And there is a general hostility not only from the elected politicians, but from the middle classes and urbanites and the intellectual elites of the country in general. While occasionally we pay lip sympathy, we never really wanted to democratize our society and empower our people to enable them to discover the possibilities and the limitations of democratic work. The second is rule of law in operation as a living reality, not merely normatively in the Constitution as we have. In order to restrain those in power, Justice Kurian Joseph very eloquently talked about it while he quoted Lord Brigham on rule of law. And in order to protect the rights of all, the rich and the poor, the powerful and the powerless, otherwise might becomes right. Democracy becomes notional. And there'll be permanent hostility and permanent injustice. We cannot wait forever in a society to be transformed. No, democracy will always improve. I'm a great believer in that. But you cannot wait for the evolution to happen in a normal course and hope for the best. We have to accelerate the process, the expression used by Sri Prithviraj Chauhan. How do you accelerate the process? Reynold Niebuhr, we all know, he said, man's propensity for justice makes democracy possible. And man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. I think it's one of the most profound sayings about the linkage between justice and democracy. I think almost any serious scholar and practitioner understands that justice and democracy are inseparable. That's the context in which we believe that rule of law, strengthening the institutions and making the normative notions of the Constitution living reality of the people of India in terms of acquiring justice is fundamental to make democracy work. Not only making people's lives better, but making our democracy work. This enterprise over these 9 days is one of optimism. Optimism based on 3 basic approaches. One, the problems of Indian democracy are not intractable. They are not even unique. There are solutions available in our own practice and tradition, in our own thought, and in the global practices and innovations. 2, even in a diverse and fractious country like India, a broad consensus is possible. Actually, despite everything that appears to the contrary, Indian people are much more amenable to a broad consensus on grand issues if only we expose the issues in a lucid and fair manner to them. Across region, language, and religion, people are united and they want the same things. A broad consensus is possible. 3, collective and informed assertion will certainly make things happen, however difficult it appears in the short term. As Margaret Mead said, a small group never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, that's the only thing that ever did. It is with this hope that this conference has been conducted, and the experience in the past 9 days shows this hope is largely realized. All the stakeholders, the key stakeholders, representatives of them, they all participated very soulfully, not perfunctorily, with depth and conviction and with insights, and very willingly, generously shared those insights and participated and debated. And there is an impressive consensus on most of the issues. Of course, there is some healthy debate on some issues, notably in the Indian judicial service. There are some voices of concern. Are we centralizing too much? And is the executive going to control the Indian judicial service because the service by definition is controlled by the executive, etc.? There are answers to that, but the issue is not so much Indian judicial service, to just give an example. It is not the form so much as the content of it, that the meritocratic nationwide recruitment with aspiration, with some of the finest young people competing so that the best talent goes into judiciary. If that principle is accepted, we can tweak it and say if the national judicial Indian service is not required or India service, we can think of some other means. But the basic principle of recruitment are the finest people with competition, I think, and with a fast track to elevation, provided they perform with accountability. I think that is the central issue. But otherwise, on most issues, there's an impressive consensus. Actually, we are very encouraged that there is such a remarkable consensus in the country. Maybe the time is right for the country. There's also a viable roadmap that is now available from the work of scholars and jurists and practitioners all over the country, as evidenced in this conference. A, that crime investigation, at least of a serious crime, if not all crime, must be insulated from political vagaries. Chauhan made that point very eloquently. B, prosecution, both strengthening it and insulating it from political vagaries while making it accountable. C, procedural law changes. A lot of work has been done by some outstanding bodies and professional bodies in the country. For accessible justice through local courts, but as an integral part of independent justice system, to take the large burden of small cases through summary proceedings. If necessary, there can be an appeal, there's no problem. But integral part of independent justice system with the complete control of the High Courts under Article 235. And finally, improvement of the capacity, forensics, resources, technology, and management. And of course, personnel in all branches. One point came very sharply in today's, which Chavan mentioned again, that economic growth, job creation, and rule of law cannot be isolated. It's not merely a grand constitutional concept. It is the very breadth of our economic life. Do we want to prosper? When we're adding 13 million young people to the job market every year without really jobs being created on that scale, in a country where aspirations are growing, but opportunities are dwindling relative to the need, we have a volatile situation. And if we don't fulfill our potential economically, not only will we lose out globally speaking, but within the country, democracy itself will be in peril. I think that's an argument that is understood. One of the approaches of this conference is, how do you make the stakeholders broadly agree? The elected leaders genuinely have apprehensions about losing control of the police. It's not entirely because they want to subvert the process of law. In a system of unaccountability, as former Chief Justice, the jurist who inaugurated the conference, Justice Venkatachalaya, said long ago to me in one of the conversations, he said, ours is a system of compensatory errors. If you want to insulate police from political vagaries, you make sure that police also are accountable to the people. Without that, you give power without accountability. That will be far more deadly than an elected leader controlling, because elected leader ultimately is accountable to people in some form or the other. So how do we bring the stakeholders together and make every segment, the elected leaders, the judges, the legal community, the police, how do you make them all realize that there is some give and take, and on the whole, everybody is a gainer, and the sum is bigger than the parts, or some of the parts. I think that seems to be now viable. A viable roadmap seems to be available on the basis of these consultations and interactions. Our faith is vindicated. We believe that a lot of work can be done. We promise you that many of us, not merely the 3 partner organizations here, but many wonderful civil society organizations and individual scholars and jurists and practitioners all over the country are exercised over this. And it's our duty to humbly sit with everybody and make sure that we all, with collective voice, pursue it constructively and creatively across party lines and build that pressure, again, the word used by Sri Prithviraj Chavan. How do you persuade the political system? I don't call it pressure, I would call it persuading the political system that it is both politically profitable and nationally good. It is both constitutionally the morally right thing, but it's also a living reality benefiting the bulk of the people. Once that argument honestly and convincingly is presented, I believe the political parties and elected leaders do come together. Time and again, we have seen that happening in the country. And I have immense faith in that. With these words, to give a general backdrop of the philosophy of these conferences and our work and our advocacy, I request Shruti, I think, is the one who is going to take us through the Hyderabad Declaration and the consensus arrived at in this conference.
Let me present it. Sumita is going to take us through the declarations.
Rule of law is the bedrock of constitutional governance and democratic society. Well-functioning rule of law institutions in a society would lead to a climate of safety and security for all citizens, while simultaneously providing universal access to a fair and effective justice system. In India, although we have normative rule of law, in practice there are serious and often crippling distortions. The criminal justice system is fraught with ineffective and archaic police, feeble prosecution, cumbersome and dilatory procedures, and inadequate judicial capacity. The ponderous civil justice system has vitiated public trust in justice delivery and produced a private industry of justice for settling disputes. Protection of individual rights, enforcement of contracts, and mutual trust are critical requirements to promote entrepreneurship, investment, job creation, and economic growth. It has been long recognized that our institutions of rule of law warrant immediate attention. If we perpetuate status quo, our society faces two grave dangers: collapse of order and deceleration of growth. Over the course of the past 9 days, broad consensus was reached upon a set of meaningful, well thought out of reforms that can go a long way in restoring public faith in the justice system and ensuring public order and safety. First, the police force needs to be strengthened with adequate personnel to effectively meet the growing challenges of a modern society and enhance public trust in police, with a proportion of officers embedded in the community to promote communication and collaboration with the citizenry. Second, a professional course in policing must be developed as a mandatory requirement at the entry level for effective training to facilitate specialized and efficient functioning of the police force. Third, forensic infrastructure needs to be scaled up to meet present day requirements, with adequate facilities available at each administrative level: the police circle, the subdivision, the district, and the state, as well as major urban city centers based on the population, crime rate, and nature of crimes. Fourth, an independent, well equipped, and accountable crime investigation agency needs to be created, separate from the Law and Order Department, to investigate crimes above a certain threshold, such as crimes punishable by a maximum of 3 years of imprisonment. 5. A strong system of prosecution at the district level must be instituted such that the competence, stature of prosecution, independence, public trust, and coordination of investigator, prosecutor, and the judge are assured. 6. Criminal procedural laws must be amended to rationalize and simplify trial procedures, ensure effective investigation with transparency and accountability, protect the rights of the victims, enhance the role of the judge in the trial process, and recognize non-custodial punishments when appropriate. 7. Measures to reform the civil justice system must be based on an empirical analysis of both the supply and demand side of the ecosystem. On the supply side, increasing the judicial resources is necessary. The demand side of the spectrum calls for limiting the scope for appeals, adjournments, and interim orders, and introducing a case management system to ensure speedy and efficient trial through mechanisms such as the sunset clause on interim orders and outcome date certainty. 8th, adequate resources, including more well-trained judges and sufficient physical infrastructure, must be allocated and effectively utilized to make the judiciary accessible to the ordinary citizens in terms of proximity, cost of litigation, and summary disposal of cases. 9th, the efficiency and efficacy of the district courts and the constitutional courts can be enhanced by setting up a robust court administration system, including appointment of highly competent judicial managers and judicial clerks, allowing judges to focus on matters of adjudication and improving professionalism in the administrative functions. 10th, the constitutional courts must be strengthened by limiting their jurisdiction to their primary role, that is, the interpretation of the Constitution and substantial questions of law. This may be achieved by setting up permanent constitutional benches in courts, reducing the number of appeals and revision petitions, and prioritizing clearing the current backlog. Ad hoc judges may be appointed according to Article 224A of the Constitution to dispose of the backlog. 11th, there is a need to attract best talent into the judiciary at the trial court level and the constitutional courts. Therefore, remuneration for judges, the service conditions, and the prestige of office all should be significantly enhanced to make judgeship aspirational for bright young lawyers. A nationwide competitive meritocratic recruitment with an assured fast track for elevation based on performance would go a long way in attracting talent. And finally, 12th, a permanent mechanism for ensuring judicial standards and accountability in the higher courts must be established to address issues of misconduct. Guidelines for the same already have been laid down in the Judicial Standards and Accountability Bill 2010, which lapsed in 2012.
Thank you. Let's give a round of clap for this great declaration. Yeah, shall we have the response from Professor K.C. Suri?
Thank you very much, Chairman. First of all, I congratulate the Foundation for Democratic Reforms and Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan for taking this initiative to organize a conference on rule of law, and thinking of our Department of Political Science at University of Hyderabad as a partner, and inviting us to cooperate in this endeavor, and also asking me to participate and speak in this concluding session. We have a large number of sessions participated by eminent persons, people of erudition, scholarship, experience, and insight in various questions of the rule of law. And we have at the end of it the Hyderabad Declaration, that Amrut that came out of the churning for the last 9 days. And it has made some wonderful points for all of us to further ponder over, and also fit for implementation by the people in power. I think this conference is yet another endeavor in the long history of our nation to establish rule of law in this country, which is not easy. As Shri Prithviraj Chauhan mentioned, rule of law is not ingrained in our thinking. The society has been based on tremendous social inequalities for a long time. And we have been living in a situation when people believe that they are unequal by birth, and their occupation should be determined at birth. And all these have had a divine sanction. So inequality is inbuilt, social inequality based on birth, based on occupation, is something very internal and integral to our social life. And rule of law thus is a revolutionary idea and revolutionary principle, which has to be thought about, propagated, publicized, and enforced. We have this long tradition. It's not something new. I think we have to also think of those people for a long time, whether in ancient India or medieval times or modern times, who fought for some kind of rule of law. I think of the Ajivikas, I think of the Charvakas, I think of the Buddha, I think of the Jainas, said that all people are equal and they must have equal entitlement in society. I think what distinguishes, as Dr. JP and also as Sri Prithviraj Chauhan reminded to us, that in all governments perform certain functions. They make rules, they adjudicate the rules, they enforce rules. This is common for all governments. We know in history, from the time we have some records, all governments made these things: the rule making, rule adjudication, and rule application are the three basic functions of any government in history. But I think what distinguishes a government in democracy is not to make rules, is not to adjudicate them, is not to enforce them, but to base all these three functions on rule of law. I think that's what the essence of democracy. I think that we have to recognize. And this has four aspects. One is that we don't need a rule by a very wise person. We don't need a person who is very good. We need a rule by law. However good the person is, however noble the mind of the person is, however the wise the person is, any rule by the discretion of the ruler is always problematic. And this recognition, I think, the way the kind of veneration, the personality cult we have in this country, that some people are beyond failing, And some of these leaders are God-given to us, and the way we admire them, adore them, flatter them, and worship them, I think there is a problem here. As Dr. JP was saying, that we have to give up some of these things, and he is just one another citizen from among us whom we have chosen in order to rule for a certain period of time, and he has to rule according to the law. He cannot rule according to his own discretion, according to his own whim, and according to his own fancy. Now, however good it may bring, that is a different matter. So I think that is one thing that we have to recognize, that the rule of law is always better than ruled by a wise person, as claimed by the person himself or regarded by the people. The second one I think we should recognize, sir, is that rule of law is a law that is in the interest of the poor and weaker sections in society, not in the interest of the strong. And third one, a rule of law, I think, also should be based on recognition that a democratic government must be based on rule by consent. The government cannot take away, in the name of public safety or public security or public well-being, individual rights which are foundational to the individual's life in society. I want to bring 3-4 aspects here very briefly. One is the Hyderabad Declaration began with the statement saying that there is a trust deficit in the institutions which enforce the law or the rules in the country. Why is so? I think that question we have to ask. We have done a large number of studies on this. And among all the public institutions in India, military comes on the top in India, and then the judiciary. About 90% people of India trust the legitimacy of these two institutions. And what institutions come at the lowest? The police and political parties. And in between, we have all the other parliamentary institutions like legislatures, government, central government, state government, local government, etc. They come in between. So on the top, we have the military and judiciary. In between, you have the elected or those institutions which are constituted through election. And then the last two are the political parties and police, which have about 30% acceptability from the people that trust these institutions. I think there is something serious in this. We have to people go. We have asked. We have done a large number of social surveys, and we have certain vignettes. We have asked people if there is a problem for you. If there's a conflict with your neighbor about your boundary, whom do you approach? When we said A has a problem with B, A and B are neighbors, and there is a boundary dispute, and B has encroached A's land, and so where should A go? And believe me, majority of people have not mentioned the institutions of the government. They said, we'll go to politician, we'll go to the local Muslim, we'll go to private individuals, the elders in the community, so on and so forth. So there is some problem here. I think we should think about that. The second one I want to bring to your attention, Chairman, is that there is so much of abuse of law enforcing institutions to frighten political opponents and to coerce political opponents. And I think the source, the source for this is craving for power. Power is considered to be the lifeline of individuals, political power. If you don't have power, people think they are dead. So losing political power is thought to be an end of life. and they become very aggressive, frustrated, abusive, and they resort to any kind of means to continue in power. And second one is amassing wealth. People, you amass wealth through whatever means you can. It doesn't really matter. And this happens among politicians, among bureaucrats, among judges, among uh, administrators. So if you don't address that, these two things, that's craving for power and craving for wealth, I think are the root of the problems of the rule of law. The last point I want to make is that I think Sri Prithviraj Chauhan and Dr. JP have emphasized the point that you cannot have economic development, economic growth without rule of law. I want to also emphasize, in addition to that, that you cannot have national unity without rule of law. That unity is possible among citizens who are free. When citizens think that there is a fair system of delivery of justice, and there is a fair system in which their rightful entitlements can be accessed and enjoyed, and the life is secure, and their well-being is guaranteed. So I think rule of law is also necessary for ensuring nation building and national unity. So with these words, I thought I would just emphasize that while institutional reforms, as we have seen in the Hyderabad Declaration, is necessary, I think we have to also interrogate certain moral and ethical foundations of our society and polity. And of course, we have been talking about it. And I think this is also time we should talk about questions of trust, questions of abuse of law enforcing institutions, and delivery of state benefits as per law to individual citizens, and the necessity of rule of law for economic growth, and the necessity of rule of law for national unity and nation building. Thank you very much, Chairman, for giving me this opportunity, and thank you, Dr. Jaiprakash Narayan, for inviting us to cooperate with you in organizing this event. And I wish you all the best in whatever efforts FDR will do to sensitize people at various levels about the questions of rule of law, and also to bring about certain institutional reforms that ensure the rule of law. Thank you very much. Namaskar.
Thank you, Professor Suri, for addressing some of the concerns which are so integral for the, as you rightly said, for the integrity, unity and integrity of the nation as well. Your concerns on those aspects as to why there should be rule of law from the national perspective, particularly in view of the diversities of the country, is also, I think, very, very relevant in the context of our country today. With that, shall we move on to say Kumaraguru?
Thank you so much, sir. Honorable Justice Kurian Joseph, Shri Prithviraj Chauhan, Dr. Jaiprakash Narayan, Professor K.C. Suri. Thank you very much for inviting me, Dr. JP Garu, to this concluding session of what has been a very wonderful week-long sort of conference. I'm here on behalf of the Indian School of Business. I want to first of all sort of compliment JP Garu and his team at FDR for organizing this conference. I still very vividly remember, or recall rather, the phone call from Chandrasekhar Gowda on 30th of August saying, JP is trying to reach ISB, and would you be willing to partner with FDR in organizing such a conference? And I think on the 31st of August, 2019, we had the first meeting between Professor Chhatri and your team. And I remember the last year in January 2020, those 2 days was really one of those conferences where every speaker, every session, you saw value, you took something away in terms of gaining knowledge and insights. So, and I'm glad the pandemic-induced lockdown hasn't really slowed down things, both in terms of the selection of themes, and also importantly, the rich and very diverse sort of backgrounds from where the speakers have come. So I want to sort of offer my compliments to you, and I'm very happy that ISB has had the opportunity to partner with you in making this possible. I think I want to keep my remarks very brief, but I'm sort of tempted to recall that today is Feb 28th, which is the National Science Day. And one of the things that we all know, whether we are, students formally of science or not, that the only way we are able to progress in terms of our sort of learning and expanding the frontiers of knowledge is by this ability to ask questions. As a student of National High School in Bangalore, I remember walking into the room of the president of the National Education Society, the great Dr. H. Narasimhaiah, one of the great rationalists that this country has seen. And he had behind him not any photograph, nothing, but just a huge question mark. And I asked him, what does this question mark represent? And he said, that's exactly my point. I want you to ask me a question, and I want you to continue to ask questions. I think it's important that today being Science Day and the fact that we are celebrating and talking about rule of law, that we as citizens and we as, irrespective of which segment of the society from a stakeholder point of view that we represent, that we retain the right to ask questions. And of course, within sort of, there's certain, boundary conditions, etc., that need not be sort of elaborated upon. But I think it's very important. But equally important is also that I think, as two of my colleagues, Professor Ashwini Chhatre and Professor Deepamani wrote an op-ed 3 days ago, talking about celebrating the value of dissent. I think it's important for us as a country, both whether it's the government of the day to sort of encourage dissent, but also more importantly as citizens, especially the educated lot amongst us, for us to sort of accept an idea or at least encourage an idea without necessarily accepting it. And I think, I take pride in the fact that education institutions should provide safe sanctuaries for debates and discussions, irrespective of which background, or which spectrum of the political sort of this thing, which side of the political spectrum that they come from. I think it's important for us to sort of, have that ability. I think there were two things that, the conference has mostly focused on. One is in terms of police and the judicial reforms. I want to just offer a very layman citizen's perspective. And I think, Shri Prithviraj Chavan spoke about it, and the others have spoken about it as well. I think there's a lot of problem within us as citizens, right? I want to give two sort of big points. One, as parents, we bring up our children, threatening them to call the police if they don't eat their dinner or meal. I mean, it's a conditioning thing. I'm sort of laying a very simplistic sort of a thing, but it's somewhere is that, it's at the very bottom, we are trying to demonize the police force unknowingly. What happens as a result is that people grow up and they don't want anything to do with the police, right? Let alone even understand what are the conditions under which our police function today. So the only thing we know or we think is that they're very corrupt, and therefore, they just have to do what they're doing and they're very well off in some sense. I think it's fundamentally wrong. I remember being at a police station in Bangalore, and someone, a young techie who was working at a major software company come into the police station on a Saturday because he had missed being at home when the constable had gone to verify for his passport verification, which is a fairly common process. So he was very concerned. He came in to ask that, I wasn't there, but I would like to get it done. So the officer in charge said that constable is not available today, but you could come back tomorrow, or I can ask him to come to your place tomorrow if you're going to be there. So he said, but tomorrow is a Sunday. So he said, would you not be at home? He said, no, I will be at home, but it must be a holiday for you. And this was, mind you, I'm not making this up. This was a young engineer working in Bangalore who was obviously, this is about 20 years ago story, but who was probably going to get his passport so that he can go abroad and work on site, etc. But that reflects the lack of sort of awareness about how people work in this country when it comes to the police. I'm also tempted to add, just share another story to just illustrate how we as citizens expect the Honorable Member of Parliament who we elect to actually take care of our bijli, sort of, the sort of sadak and the sort of waste disposal, when that's not what they're elected for. Again, an incident from just about a week ago. I was in the office of the Honorable Member of Parliament of Bangalore South, and the person ahead of me who was talking to him had a very peculiar problem. So she, after initial courtesies, she said, "You have to help me." And he said, "How can I help you?" She said, "This is my son's marks card from a Carnatic, sort of vocal examination that is conducted by the Karnataka State, Secondary Education Board." And she said he scored low in the exam, and therefore has come in second division or something. She said, "Can you somehow do something?" So he said, "What can I do about it?" So she said, "Can you somehow influence? You are an MP, you can do anything." So he said, "This is a vocal examination." And her excuse was, and I'm sure it was a valid one, she said that, the boy had corona, so his voice wasn't very good, whatever, etc. But he said, this is not even a case where you can apply for revaluation, because you can apply for a revaluation for a written paper, but for a vocal performance, you've already performed. The jurors have already, the examination panel has judged the boy, but she wouldn't sort of accept it. She said, "You are an MP, you can do anything." And that, to me, is another example that I just want to share with all of us about our lack of understanding of law, right? If we expect rule of law in this country, I would also remind ourselves as citizens that we should do a better job of creating some awareness for ourselves, so that we can then demand better from our elected representatives, from people who are in the police or in the sort of bureaucracy and so on. And I just thought that on a Sunday evening, sharing a couple of these things would sort of remind us that it's not like somebody is going to come and solve these problems for us. A lot of this is just for us to really work towards. And on that note, I want to sort of again compliment all of you, and it's a great honor to be here with all of you on behalf of ISB. I will just end with one very quick thing that JP Garu, ISB and University of Hyderabad are neighbors, but in academia we don't really collaborate as much as we should. So I want to thank you for bringing us together, two neighboring institutions, in sort of working together on such a very important conference, and look forward to working with you as we build this going forward. Thank you very much.
That's great, Sri Kumaraguru. From we call it from a layman's perspective, he spoke coming to brass tacks, what is rule of law. You have been so forthright and so blunt. Starting from the very concept of our what you call parenting, while we feed our children or grandchildren for us, we say, no, if you don't eat, we'll call the police. So that is the, yes. Thank you. And we need to address the concerns that you also addressed. We need to change ourselves from our concepts as to how do we, for your information, the first fundamental duty is to abide by the Constitution and the laws made thereunder. So how do we abide by the Constitution? It's a fundamental duty. So it's for us to abide by law and become law-abiding citizens. And that's very important. Instead of asking somebody to break law. That is a wonderful concern that you addressed. Because our mindset is, we approach the politicians asking them to break law. Yes, and get, which is not otherwise permissible under law. Because our idea about the politicians is, that, they have a freedom to, they have a liberty, rather, a free liberty to violate any law and get anything done with their power of muscle or power, whatever it is. So thank you. With this, we have, shall we get back to Priti?
Thank you, Justice Kurian Joseph. Thank you to all our panelists for so eloquently putting across the need for rule of law reforms. Speaking of the Hyderabad Declaration, it is an outcome of wide-ranging discussions and consultations that we had spanning 9 days. I would like to thank all our panelists for actively contributing to this initiative. May I now request Chair Justice Kurian Joseph and Shri Prithviraj Chavan to give their comments on the declaration. It will help us fine-tune the reform agenda in the future. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Priti. That is, yeah. So we have a declaration. So what are we going to do with the declaration? That's what the comment that you're asking for. To me, we need to follow up on this declaration because we have several declarations and we leave at that. For us judges, we have a Bangalore declaration on our code of conduct. You spoke something about the bill that lapsed, bill introduced in 2010 and lapsed in 2012 on accountability. But as early as in 1993, we have an in-house mechanism, but we call it as a Bangalore declaration. Yes, there are. We don't lack declarations. We have declarations and declarations, but how do we take forward? So to me, I feel that, Dr. Jayaprakash, with your FDR, we need to concentrate on each of the 9 points you have set in the declaration as to educating our children. Some of us are speakers, some of us also address as what we need to, and thereafter, particularly on this issue of the judiciary, the constitutional courts concentrating on constitutional issues and other disputes being left to a different forum altogether. And the investigation mechanism in the country being insulated and be brought under the control of, there must be somebody to control it, but under the control of whom? Now, according to all of us, the public perception is that the keeper is the poacher. So we need to insulate the keeper from the poacher. So we need to think about more deliberations on this, because the Committee on Police Reforms also have, addressed this concern also, how to insulate. Right from Vineet Narayan, there is a reference, because thereafter only in a bench in which I was also a party, in the Korskam case, former Chief Justice said it is a caged parrot. Now it is not a caged parrot. I think it is now a ghost to us, just come out of that Aladdin's. See, the prosecution agencies in the state, they have lost their credibility. I used to ask this question publicly: which constitutional institution in the country which has not been shaken for its foundational aspirations or foundational vision on their independence, integrity, and credibility? And of course, which is public trust is part of it. All institutions, we thought, will be wholly insulated and they will only be constitutionally controlled. Now they're all being institutionally controlled, if not constitutionally guided. That has been the curse of this country now. Dr. Prithvi Chavan referred to that aspect as well. Why the Indian democracy has lost its luster. And the space and the voice in democracy is also a big question. The citizens' space and the voice of the citizens in democracy. So all these aspects, I thought, we need to tackle from the grassroots level. Some, of course, on the policy level, we need to form public opinion on policies, and we need to reform ourselves in the sense, from grassroots, as Professor Surya and Mr. Guru suggested. We need to have our own educational systems improved, and we need to have what we call the more and more youngsters participating in the building up of nation. Making something in India is not the building up of the nation. There's hardly any nation building now. We need to build up a nation. And this Constitution of India is the only holy book which probably can keep this India as a nation. But for that, with all the diversities in this country, it would have been a difficult task, if not an impossible task. There's no other country in the world with these 22 scheduled languages, around 900 non-scheduled languages, with all world-known religions in the country, all civilizations, cultures, yes, everything in the country. Even the topography also, it contains everything. India is a miracle that way. Yet, with all this, India is India only because of this Constitution of India. So we need to strengthen this Constitution of India. And we can strengthen this Constitution of India only by strengthening constitutional institutions. This is my view always. We need to restore the credibility of the constitutional institutions regarding their independence, regarding their integrity, regarding their constitutional role, and regarding their purity. It's only then I think there'll be a change. So we need to address those concerns. One, from within ourselves, two, by forming public opinion. These are my 2 comments on that.
Thanks a lot, sir. Prithviraj Chavan, sir, may I now have your comments on the declaration?
Thank you. I think the declaration really sums up your week-long series of exercise, different seminars and different people coming in and tackling the vexatious problems that the government faces. I must compliment you on all that. And where do you go from here? It's a very good document. Will it just be a wish list? Can it really make an impact on the society? Can it change things? I think I have some random thoughts on where we can go from here. One is who will deliver this change? One of the things is, of course, some of the things are very lofty ideals, extending the constitution, extending the institutions. I mean, who is the person? What has weakened the systems? Let's ask ourselves that. We know the answers. We may differ. We know what has happened. So who can effect the change? I think if you take things bit by bit, one of the things, concrete suggestion I have is one of the agencies which will bring about change is legislators, state legislature, the parliament. They are the ones who will allot enough money and enough resources to build capacity. Key thing, of course, is to increase our numbers, our capacity, the courtrooms, the judges, the police, the training institutions, forensic lab, all that requires money. And that money can be sanctioned by the executive or the legislature largely. So how can we make a beautiful presentation that you had made in the booklet on that? We go to the legislatures, call some legislators and have a maybe one-day seminar on issues that generally broadly we are aware of. Everybody is expressing the same concern that you have concerns as citizens, representatives. Every day we have to face the problems of police excesses, delays in the courts, where to go, access to justice, the cost of justice, all those problems we face every day. Now, if you are able to maybe go to many advocacy groups, have gone to the group of legislatures and sort of brought a fresh light on the problems that we face. Some of them can be sorted by the legislators decide that, look, I want to make good the shortage of judges. And let's, at least in our state, make sure that the vacancies are filled. The police vacancies, we do something about it. We need more training colleges. Yes, we sanction money for that. Forensic labs, yes, we improve the quality of those labs, and we do that. There are certain other issues to how to bring about quality of change in our judiciary and our policing system. I think I, for one, are a strong proponent of Indian judicial service. There are some issues. I have handled All India services like the IAS and IPS in Delhi. I think the fear that central government will control everything is unfounded. I mean, they all do is just recruit them and train them, and after that, they belong to the state. And we can even build in more safeguards to allay the fear that it will be controlled by center. But I think meritoriously selected from a very tough All India examination is what should man our judicial system. I'm even going one step further. I've also made a suggestion at one time that we should also have a sister service to the Indian Police Service, which should be called Indian Security Service, which will man, say, central armed police forces, will harm intelligence agencies, CBIs, NIAs, IB and ROS. So after some time, after the basic police training and maybe working in the state for some time, separation can happen. Current situation, I think, needs to improve. I think I'm all for all India services and selectively meritorious people from all India basis. And of course, the judicial service has to be made attractive, more attractive than serving a corporate firm, which is very, very remunerative. So there has to be prestigious associated to a prosecutor and a judge. That's a process we have to start working on. My suggestion would be if you can take the Hyderabad Declaration to taking it to law colleges and other colleges would be one thing, but more to legislators and parliaments. There is a mechanism, there are some NGOs working to work with parliamentarians like ADR and others, which I'm familiar with. And then we can shine the light about the problems that face the whole rule of law gamut, how we can start nibbling at the problems. We can start bringing. One of them is capacity building, which requires money. Improving our legal education would be something which does not need a legislative change. It can be worked through bar councils and other mechanisms, and we should do that. For giving support to judges, something which can really do, making a mandatory internship for legal graduates also is something which can make build consensus for it. The prosecution, separate prosecution service and separating investigative against prosecution will require legal persons to put their heads together and make sure that all states agree, because some states have taken steps in that direction. Even bringing a different procedural change like the DA system, American DA system, would require much more debate and thinking and all that. But I think some small changes can be brought about. But we are facing a huge challenge of adequate resources to man judges, to have Supreme Court vacancies, more courtrooms, and everything. And that requires support at the executive level, that requires support at even the parliament, which passes the budgets, the legislature will pass the budgets. How can you bring pressure on the decision-making system that we need more? It will not come free. There's no free lunch. You have to spend money to get a better justice system, a better policing system, right from training to looking after their comforts. Everything has to come together in the package. But one thing is, I must compliment you, hard work that you put in. I mean, all the committees that have gone on before us, various law commissions, the board, State Reforms Commission, was in really in the government when we brought out the reports. The Parliament Committee in Padmanabh, all these reports are there. You really brought all it together and taken the best out of that. I think now we have to just move forward and implement good ideas on which we can easily agree. We may not be able to agree on everything. We can agree on a lot of things, and I think we should let's try to get the low-hanging fruit. Whatever we can agree to, let's try to go ahead and get that. Dissemination of Hyderabad station. Thank you.
So much, sir. Dr. JP, we recognize that there is much to be done. So given this context, how should we prioritize our reforms? What should be our starting point? And what are the low-hanging fruits in this political climate that can be picked and a reform can be initiated? We are already witnessing some initiatives being undertaken in criminal reforms. How do we make sure that we don't lose this opportunity?
Riti, as Chavan Saab said, we must prioritize. There are three broad areas of reform we are looking at. One is improving infrastructure, resources, human, financial, technology, etc. That is the easiest part, provided some money is available, because there is no political resistance. Nobody in today's world wants a situation where a DNA analysis takes 2 years or 3 years, even in a capital city like Delhi or a big city like Mumbai. It's an insult to the country, and it simply is not justice. So that is the easy part. And the money that we require for all this is not big in the larger context of India's public expenditure. It will probably only account for 0.1 or 0.2% of GDP. While it is significant, it is not something very big. The second is procedural reform, for which already groundwork has been done significantly. And we have to push at least bits and pieces wherever they are necessary. And that's more technical issue, and a lot of jurists and legal minds that are involved in that. The toughest one is how to insulate crime investigation from political vagaries and prosecution from political vagaries. There, we must be very practical. We must be pragmatic. We must understand the legitimate political compulsions, and therefore must not ask for the moon. In our proposals, what we have tried is that 85% of the crime investigation work relates to smaller crimes. And that's what really local politicians and others are worried about, because the public perception, injustice to the poor, and so on and so forth. In any case, no system can take over all the 1 crore 20 lakh or so cases that are filed every year suddenly to a sophisticated investigative agency. We don't have the capacity. Therefore, the regular police stations as they exist today, let them continue to handle about 80% of the crime investigation workload pertaining to smaller offenses. Nothing new, it's happening anyway. We will have some accountability mechanisms wherever feasible on the basis of Supreme Court judgment. But otherwise, let's not worry too much about that. But if the crime is 3 years and more, only those 15-20% crimes will be to an independent agency, CBCIDs, but completely monitored by an independent board of investigation and prosecution headed by the former judges, a former High Court Chief Justice or Supreme Court judge of that caliber. Similarly, prosecution, an independent prosecution mechanism, a director being drawn from the judiciary, again, a former judge of the High Court. And at the district level, like law secretaries in many states are brought from the district judges on a deputation basis. For some time, for a tenure of 5 years, they will work with the prosecution. District judges or chief judicial magistrates below the district judge rank, because they will have protocol problems. But they'll go back to judiciary. Therefore, independence is assured because it's integral to the system of judiciary. And they will lead the whole prosecution in the whole district. And they will all be monitored in turn by the Independent Prosecution and Investigation Board. So this is a viable mechanism. This is the toughest change, but it's possible. Now, all states may not do it. We can do it through CRPC. We can do it in each state. We will figure out the technical mechanism by which this can be implemented. I'm an optimist. We have seen many changes happen. There are some changes I've seen in the Constitution itself. In 1 hour, we could persuade the governments. It took 3-4 years to be pursued. 97th Amendment took me exactly 1 hour to persuade the government at that time. Shri Prithviraj Chavan was at the time government. It took me only 1 hour to persuade the key political leaders of the country. The process took another 2-3 years, and then the 97th Amendment, giving autonomy to cooperatives constitutionally, recognizing the rights of cooperatives under Article 19(1)(c). It was done. A very big amendment in its scope, actually. There are some which are relatively small changes, simply improving the voter registration process. Doesn't require law, doesn't require politics, only election commission. We've been struggling for 20 years. There is some marginal improvements, but nothing much happened beyond a point. So sometimes, if you align things properly, things could happen very fast. But if you segregate them under practical, not badmouth the decision makers, please understand they have legitimate role. In fact, they have greater legitimacy than you and I. The elected leaders are the most legitimate people. They're the only ones people of India have chosen in democracy. If we don't respect that, if we don't accept their decision-making authority and their concerns, and then figure out what is the best way to reconcile their concerns with the public good, this is a non-starter. If we simply indulge in politician baiting, as is typical in many democracies, and particularly so in India, that does not help. That's why if you notice in our whole conference, all the panelists and the speakers, there was never any breaching of that unspoken line. There is civility, there is decorum, there is a very objective approach rather than blame throwing. There is no demonization of either the police or the politician or the judge. That doesn't help at all. So even our approach itself makes a lot of difference. I'm optimistic. If we segregate into infrastructure and resources, procedures, and installation of crime investigation and prosecution. I think bit by bit, even if it doesn't happen overnight, it will happen, significant things will happen. One last word on this. Mahatma Gandhi said, a reformer must have infinite patience. That is a lesson that I have learned in my life. When we embarked on this in 1996, I was really impatient. We thought in 5 years' time, we'll all achieve this, because the people with science and technology background, Kumar Guru also is probably from technology background. We all go by evidence, rationality, logic. Solution is evident, it must happen tomorrow. And so is the case with Shri Prithviraj Chauhan. He is a technocrat himself by training. I'm sure it has taken years and years of acclimatization to understand the societies don't change as fast as technology and rationality allows you to. So we must have infinite patience and pursue it relentlessly. Sometimes things happen in a big way, sometimes small bits and pieces, but over time they'll happen. But the most important change in the risk is not getting changes in place on paper. We have got many things done. Local courts law, FDR was played a pioneering role in that. The law was enacted, not for the whole area, local areas, but only for rural areas, but still a very sound law. Where is implementation? Practically none. India is very good at normatively putting in place a law, but very perfunctory in implementation. It never happens. That is the worst thing that can happen. Therefore, I would much rather make sure that something actually works rather than something is there on paper. And that's where the ownership, the buy-in for the key decision makers, and therefore you must do a lot of hard work. And I'm sure with this, people like Shri Prithviraj Chauhan and Shri Kurian Joseph, many other eminent people who participate in this exercise, plus many others who are working on similar grounds, we'll all get together with humility. One thing I've always believed is God, I do not know if there is a God, I'm an agnostic, but I'm only quoting the saying, God makes great things happen through people who do not care who get the credit. If we take ourselves out of the equation, but if you put the purpose in the forefront and assiduously and with absolute conviction work for that, I believe many more changes are possible than are ordinarily realized. And that is, in fact, the story of our small little movement and organization. Because it is right, not because we are great as individuals, because it is right and many people can see that. And this conference proved that beyond doubt. So many people of diverse backgrounds in a variety of fields, almost identical language and very similar conclusions. That means the time is right. I'm sure we can make it happen if we get ourselves together.
Thank you so much, sir, for these thoughtful remarks. There is this one question that we have been getting on our sessions, and I would like Professor Suri to give his remarks on this. How can citizens play an active role in the reform process?
That's a very tough question. I think there are various ways in which citizens can play a role. Number one, I think in choosing their representatives in the first place, if they can choose, as Dr. JP was saying, that politicians ultimately, they control power, and they are the ones who should control power, who should exercise authority, who makes decisions. So I think the first task is to make right choices in selecting or choosing or electing, or and we have the democracy is all about, at least in some perspective, in the perspective of some theoreticians and practitioners, the democracy is all about choosing between competing sets of politicians. So, and that comes periodically. And that choice has to be free, the process has to be fair, and the aggregation of individual choices into a collective choices that is binding on all, investing this authority in the hands of the people who should ensure a rule of law. I think if citizens take care of that, that's number one. Number two, I think while we criticize the government as citizens, we criticize because we expect from the government more than what it is doing. It's not that it is the disaffection that makes citizens critical of the government. I think that's the wrong thing. I think that's what many governments or police officers or judges, or administrative officers think, that people are always criticizing. Why do people criticize? People criticize because these institutions are not matching up with their expectations, because expectations are always in principle or always theoretical, because these are all laid down in the constitution or in a law or in a procedure of the law. And this is supposed to be implemented. This is supposed to be happening. And when that doesn't happen, citizens become critical. And that criticism is always constructive. That criticism should be welcome. There is one famous democracy theorist called Pippa Norris. In fact, she wrote a book called Critical Citizens. And she said that critical citizens are fundamental to democracy and rule of law, because citizens are critical precisely because they believe in democracy, because they believe that these institutions can deliver. If they don't criticize, that means they have become disaffected with the institutions and they go out of the system. Only those who are in the system are always critical. Those who are outside the system, as JP was pointing out, they denounce it. They don't care for the system. They want to destroy it. So criticism, I think, a healthy, constructive criticism, we should develop. And we should know what the criticism is. And those who occupy the positions of power should know why criticism is important. Criticism is important to rectify one's own self. That is the essence of democratic life. That it helps me. It rectifies. Democracy is all about self-rectification. And dictatorship is always, because the self-rectification is not there in dictatorships, they get overthrown through rebellions and insurrections. And democracy is enduring because it has a self-corrective mechanism. And I think in that sense, if citizens develop an attitude of criticism, which is constructive and cooperative and systemic, that will help. A third thing is citizen initiatives are very important. And I think this is one of those initiatives that we are seeing here under the leadership of Jayaprakash Narayan, like Lok Satta or FDR now. And such institutions are everywhere in the country. And I think if citizen collectives come together, and this is what several democracy theorists told us. Tocqueville said that American democracy survives because of citizens' enthusiastic and energetic participation in civil society activity. Where civil society is strong, your democracy is strong, your rule of law becomes stronger. So I think we need more and more citizen collectives participating in ensuring that these are, the problem with what JP said, politicians don't do on their own. There has to be a demand. There has to be pressure from the civil society. I think that role, there was a study, some time ago, that the lowest civil society participation is in India. India is one of the countries which, there may be millions of organizations, registered organizations, but if you look at the participation levels, about 5% people of India are members of any civil society group, which is one among the lowest in the world compared to some of the developed countries, developed democracies. So I think we have to, people say that there is too much of activity, civil society. Actually, it is not there. So I think there has to be greater civil society activity and civil society initiative. I think these are some of the ways in which, and the civil society activity has to be non-partisan. That is another contradiction. The last point I want to mention to you is that the studies are showing that the party membership in India is one among the highest in the world, at least the way they are claiming. About 40% of citizens of India are claiming that they are with one or the other party, which is very high. So somehow the party attachments, which may be for different reasons, and these party attachments can be very fragile and volatile, and they can shift very quickly, unlike in stable Western democracies. So I think what we need is this too much of preoccupation with political parties must come down, and greater inclination towards civil society activity, independent of political parties and partisanship. If that increases, I think that will also help for the kind of development of the spirit of the rule of law. Thank you, Vritti.
Thank you, Professor Suri. It is always a pleasure listening to you. My next question is for Sri Kumaraguru. Sir, you represent relatively younger generation of the populace. So a similar question. So what do you think how young professionals can contribute to this reform agenda?
Thank you, Vritti. I think you're being very generous when you say I represent a younger this thing. You are the representative of this thing. But I think I take solace in the fact that the average life expectancy in India is increasing, and therefore I feel now as probably younger. But I think to your question, more on a more serious note, I think I do want to, because it's a question that is, what should young people do to get involved with reforms? I think one thing it is clear is that young people today are very impatient, and not in a negative sense. They're impatient because they want action, they want results, and more importantly, they're willing to work hard towards it, right? So if you were to think of it from that point of view, I think anything that we have to try and create a framework where they can engage towards participating in this reforms agenda in this country, right? And I have a simple three way approach. One, I think 3 A's, right? One is either through awareness, or through action, or through advocacy. Anything that you want to do, I think these are the 3 ways in which you can perhaps get engaged. One, for example, awareness. I think we've spoken about it in the past 90 odd minutes and enough examples that young people need to be more aware, right? Today, we all conduct ourselves like a 9 p.m. news anchor, and no offense to any news anchor who do these things, and it's not an easy task. What I mean to sort of convey is that the job of a 9 p.m. news anchor is very difficult. You get variety of issues on which you got to engage with the audience, but you can only do for 20 minutes, right? And then you go to the next point. But I don't think we can solve the country's problem, or at least claim to solve the country's problems, by saying, I know it all merely because I read 4 WhatsApp forwards or I read a headline, right? I think that's important, therefore, for us to sort of create awareness, increase our awareness. And there are any number of organizations and online platforms which will help us increase awareness. 2, nothing beats action. Unless figuratively you get your hands dirtied and get involved in trying to do something, only then you will appreciate how difficult or how complex it is to run and manage a country like India. I do a very simple exercise when I meet a lot of international delegates who come to ISB, youngsters and otherwise, who sort of want to come, and one of the things they ask is about understanding India. And I have 2 things that I talk to them. One is about how this tourism tagline of Incredible India is actually applicable to all sectors of India, right? It's not just a tourism campaign. India is truly incredible in every sense. The second thing that I do, which is actually more easier one, is I tell them that, do you have a currency note of Indian rupee, any currency sort of note with you of any denomination? Invariably they pick it up. And I ask them to turn it around, whichever side, one side, and see the number of languages in which the denomination value is listed. Right, as Justice Joseph mentioned, 22 scheduled languages, but the scripts are lesser than 22, and that's when it hits you that how complex this country is in terms of just being able to manage things. But if you don't act, or if you're not involved ever, then you're not going to do it. I think we have to create outlets for youngsters to get involved, and youngsters are keen to get involved. That's the second thing. And the third is about advocacy. The ones who have, by virtue of training, maybe law students or law graduates or people of political science, economics, whatever, what have you, or even technology for that matter, because a lot of problems today in this country we're solving because of technology. I mean, tomorrow when, vaccination is opened up to a much larger population, it's simply because on the basis of a technology platform that, we are able to sort of create some of these things. So I think we have to also create an opportunity for them to get involved and create, advocacy sort of issues on some of these things. So broadly, I think one, let us trust the younger generation today. I think they're capable of doing sort of things that are infinitely of a much higher sort of value and sort of disproportionate to their age as we traditionally may think. But it's also for youngsters to also therefore say that I can't just be an armchair critic or an armchair sort of, an intelligentsia, so to speak. I need to go out there and get myself immersed in some of these things. So that's my 2 bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
We're nearing 7 o'clock. Shall we conclude?
Yeah, before we conclude, quick comments from our chair, Justice Kurian Joseph. Sir.
No, I think as JP said, we have spoken enough. Now we had the responses from the participants also. So we need to start from this Gandhian perspective again. If you ask me, let us be the change that we want to see in others.
Thank you, sir.
I think it's been a very heartening kind of exercise, full of hope that problem is appears intractable, but can be could begin to attack the problem, and everybody agrees what needs to be done, but how to do is a issue. I think with some action, some advocacy, I think we can try to bring some changes, but we must continue this work. I compliment you for having gone through this huge, endless exercise for about 8-10 days and to come to something which all can easily digest. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, sir. Before a formal vote of thanks is proposed, I truly thank you for your guidance and leadership on a Sunday afternoon for extremely busy people in public life and in professional work. To spare 2 hours is not easy. I know how much it means. And you and many other panelists throughout these 9 days, they have not done it perfunctorily. They have done it soulfully. They've done it with great insights. They've done it with passion. They engaged in discussion, debate, and disagreement with a desire to bring about a synthesis and a resolution. And I believe, as an optimist, that there is actually much more that unites us than divides us. And there is an impressive amount of consensus. I didn't expect it, honestly, Justice Joseph, because we are an argumentative bunch as a country, and lawyers more so, the judicial community much more so. I know how hard it is to bring about consensus, because one word, one comma would be disruptive. Considering that, I am actually very, very impressed and very pleasantly surprised at the degree of consensus that has emerged on the detail. There are, of course, still some issues to be gone into some detail. But I believe there's much greater consensus than I thought would be possible at this point of life, at this stage of life. And I thank you all. And as I said before, we seek your continued guidance and leadership in actually making this happen. This is not an idle exercise in talk. This is not an academic exercise. This is not to debunk academics, but ultimately it must be about action and outcomes for the country. We are passionately devoted to that. And we believe that it's possible to bring about changes without being unduly overly optimistic. We believe in a long-term sense optimism is possible. As I said before in one of the sessions, we often overestimate our capacity to bring about change in the short term. We think that miracles will happen in the next 3 months. We underestimate our capacity to bring about change in the long term, because a strategic change in direction at an appropriate point of time can bring about significant change in outcomes over a period of time if you know how to do it. But the issue is it a perfunctory change or a strategic change? I think all of us, ISP and University of Hyderabad and FDR, we all have some understanding of strategic change and managing change and engineering change with your guidance and leadership. We look forward to that guidance and leadership on a continued basis. This country has tremendous future. I truly believe that as a democracy with all our imperfections. But if we simply rest on our laurels and pretend that we are already a great democracy, nothing needs to be done, then I think, like the economists talk about the middle income trap, we could also get to end up in a middling democracy trap. We have some normative democratic norms in place, regular elections, freedom, peaceful transfer of power, and so on and so forth. But otherwise, there is no content to democracy. That danger is real if we don't open our eyes to it and then constantly strive to actually improve our instruments and our institutions and our incentives across the board. And I believe it's both possible and necessary. And let's do the best we can. And thank you for sparing your Sunday afternoon and the rest of the weekend, at least, enjoy yourselves. And Riti, for a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir. As they say, all good things come to an end. So is this edition of the Indian Democracy at Work conference, but certainly not a commitment to strengthen our democracy. Thank you all for tuning in. It's been an exciting 9-day journey listening to some of the finest experts and hosting our committed participants. On behalf of the entire Indian Democracy at Work team, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to all our speakers for sharing their findings and insights on this important subject of rule of law. We received comprehensive feedback on our advocacy proposals, and we promise that under your leadership and guidance, we'll take up these recommendations and persuade the key stakeholders. Thank you so much. We appreciate the commitment and enthusiasm shown by our participants. Your engagement is highly motivating. Active citizenry is indeed a vital ingredient for a vibrant democracy. Thank you so much. A vote of thanks would be incomplete without acknowledging the brilliant effort put in by our volunteers and partners. Thank you all. Our democracy has certainly stood the test of time. However, there are many interlocks that need reform. We'll be back next year with another actionable agenda. We are certain that our persistent efforts will yield results that we all hope for. Signing off for the year, with gratitude, Riti Bansal.
One word, Mr. Chairman. A fantastic applause for this wonderful team. Riti, Shruti, Sumedha, and Shweta, and a few others in the background, and Keshav Reddy. They did a fabulous job. I did very little. I must tell you, I'm very much like the panelists and the guests. I did very little work. They've done a fabulous job. They make us all proud. And my confidence in the next generation to carry forward this torch is significantly enhanced in the past 9 days. I salute to all of you. Thank you very much.
Get some boys also.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for inviting.
Thank you. God bless you. Stay blessed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
To all the participants, the recordings of all the sessions are available on our YouTube channel, Indian Democracy at Work conference. You can also email any of your comments or questions to our email address, contact@indiandemocracyatwork.com.